Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Max Delaney. I'm Artistic Director here at ACCA, and we are really delighted to welcome you this evening for this special lecture by renowned American art historian, writer and curator, Amelia Jones, focusing on essentialism, feminism and art, which we are really excited to present in collaboration with MUMA in this final week of ACCA's current exhibition, Unfinished Business, Perspectives on Art and Feminism. I'd like to sincerely acknowledge the Boomerang, traditional owners and sovereign custodians of the land upon which we meet, along with the Wurundjeri and all Kulin nations, and we extend our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people who join us this evening. Unfinished Business, Perspectives on Art and Feminism is an exhibition which explores the diverse scope of feminist art practice, so we are especially honoured to have the involvement this evening of Professor Amelia Jones, who has done so much to elaborate the productive complexity of queer feminist art histories, theories, counter-narratives and positions. This evening's lecture is presented in association with Monash University Museum of Art and the Boiler Room series, and we are delighted to collaborate with MUMA's director Charlotte Day and Kate Barber, Audience and Development and Public Programs, in the presentation of this lecture. And I also acknowledge ACCA's curator of public programs, Annabelle Lacroix. Charlotte will shortly introduce Amelia, and following her lecture, we're equally delighted to welcome back Professor Anne Marsh, Professorial Research Fellow at the Victorian College of the Arts, to convene further discussion. Anne's work has been an inspiration to our current exhibition, and we are delighted to have had the involvement of both Charlotte and Anne in our current series of public programs, and also to have collaborated with aspects of Doing Feminism, Sharing the World, the curatorial residency, performance and conference program which Anne convened over the summer. Unfinished Business was conceived as a collaborative, polyphonic project involving many voices and positions, so it's especially rewarding to welcome Amelia Jones to Melbourne, along with Charlotte and Anne's involvement. So without further ado, please welcome our wonderful colleague, MUMA Director and ACCA alumnus Charlotte Day, to introduce Amelia.
Two nights in a row is pretty good, isn't it? I'm feeling a bit at home, Max. So MUMA, in partnership with the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, is really pleased to present this evening's lecture by renowned American art historian, writer and curator Amelia Jones. I'd really like to thank Max and Annabelle too from ACCA for making this lecture tonight possible. Last year we learned through our colleagues at the University of Queensland Art Museum, where we've currently got an exhibition that we're partnering on, that they were intending to invite Amelia Jones to visit Australia. We were delighted to work with them and our colleagues at the Victorian College of the Arts to host Amelia's visit in Melbourne. So it's a bit of a team activity, which is always the best. The timing of her visit could not have been more fortuitous, as Max mentioned. It's the last week of Unfinished Business, which has been an exhibition that has raised many questions and led to some very rich discussions, and this is going to be an important part of the final week. Amelia's paper tonight is titled Essentialism, Feminism and Art, Spaces Where Women Oozes Away. Quite nice kind of polarity in that title. And it will explore the question of how we understand identity, particularly gender, sex identity, in relation to the visual arts. This evening's lecture will be convened by Professor Anne Marsh from the University of Melbourne. I know that many of you are very familiar with Amelia's work and of course know Anne well, but for those who may not be, Amelia Jones is the Robert A. Day Professor of Art and Design and Vice Dean of Critical Studies at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of South California in LA. She is known for her work to dismantle the sexist, racist and homophobic structure of the art world and seeks to elaborate a queer, anti-racist, feminist history and theory of modern and contemporary Euro-American visual arts. Her recent publications have explored the work of artists previously marginalised from art discourse and institutions. Current research addresses the confluence of queer, feminist and performance in the visual arts, including a forthcoming book entitled In Between Subjects, a critical genealogy of queer performance. Amelia was the curator of the landmark exhibition Sexual Politics, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party in Feminist Art History at UCLA's Hammer Museum of Art in 1996, and Material Traces, Time and the Gesture in Contemporary Art at the Concordia University, Montreal in 2013. She has received many awards and grants throughout her career, including a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2000, the Distinguished Feminist Art Award from the College Art Association in 2015, the President's Award for Art and Activism, Women's Caucus for Art 2018, and the Fulbright US Scholar Award to do research in Auckland, New Zealand in 2018. Previous to her work at USC, Jones served as a Professor of Art History at the University of California, Riverside, the University of Manchester, and McGill University. Professor Anne Marsh is the Professorial Research Fellow at VCA, as Max mentioned. Her books include The Culture of Photography in Public Space, 2015, edited with Melissa Miles and Daniel Palmer, Performance Ritual Document, Macmillan, 2014, and the now classic Body and Self, Performance in Art in Australia, 1969 to 1992, that was first released in 1993 and a Kindle edition in 2015, so a wonderful respondent to have. I'd like to thank Andy Richards for providing help with AV this evening. Thank you very much. So please join me in welcoming Amelia.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I didn't even really get that I was going to be able to see this show, so that kind of dawned on me over the last few days, and that's been a really exciting lead-in to this paper. So thank you, Kate Barber in particular, for helping so much with the arrangements of this trip, and Max and Charlotte and everyone involved. In a 1994 interview with Ellen Rooney, Gayatri Spivak grapples extensively with the question of essentialism in feminist thought, arguing towards the end of the lengthy dialogue, quote, "It is my task as a reader to see where in that grid there are the spaces where, in fact, woman oozes away, you know. Essences, it seemed to me, are just a kind of content. All content is not essence," unquote. Spivak's formulation makes clear that essentialism lurks at the foundation of feminism. For what has feminism been but a politics associated with the rights of people identified as women through their experiences, which are in turn based on supposedly immutable, or at least determinable, anatomical, psychological, and intellectual traits. And yet Spivak's point about woman oozing away reminds us that woman, or women for that matter, are illusory constructions, not essential content, defining what it means to be identified as female. Is essentialism lurking in all feminist discourse? While women's rights claims could be and sometimes are based on the argument that men and women are exactly the same and should thus be treated completely equally, this has not been a common form of feminism in academia and in artistic work. So-called cultural feminism, including an influential arm of the 1970s feminist art movement in the United States, has long rested on essentializing bases in its assertion that women have different values, sensibilities, and experiences from men. As feminist art historian Arlene Raven noted in answer to the question, "What is feminist art?" quote, "It is first of all woman's art, a point of view about female experience from the inside of that experience," unquote. And even the feminist visual theorists and artists who challenge such arguments, often called anti-essentialist or post-structuralist in purview, built their models of analysis on the notion that gender constructs can be identified across cultural formations through models such as Freudian theories of sexual difference. These theories, too, are thus also, though in different ways, arguably implicitly prescriptive or naturalizing in the end. Essentialism, making claims that gender or gender experience is in some way structurally inherent, is thus to some degree essential to feminism, but also the bane of its existence. Among other things, in feminist art discourse, the essentializing tendency we see in Raven's claim implies that all women are feminist artists, and that no anatomically male artists or people in between can be feminist. as well as that we all know what female experience is, or that it's universalizable. This was to some degree a crucial claim to be able to make in the heyday of coalitional identity politics. But if gender is based on anatomy, experience, or immutable and inherent structures of sexual difference, then it is presumably determinable and determining in advance of interpretation or relational exchanges among subjects. Spivak's oozing away implies otherwise, and I will get back to her point at the end of this essay. Visuality and embodiment have everything to do with how we identify and make sense of gender and sex identity. Feminist visual theory, coming from art as well as film discourse, has thus had a central role in debates about essentialism. The consistent use of Freud's theory of fetishism in feminist visual theory in the 1970s and 1980s testifies to the persistence of notions of visible difference as somehow essentially determinant in male versus female experience. Freud's theory of fetishism and his related models of sexual differentiation have been foundational to common understandings of gender-sex identity as well as to feminist visual theory, from Laura Mulvey's classic 1975 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, onward. Freud's theory is indisputably based on a ground of visible, thus implicitly essential, anatomical difference between the male and female subject to define the perception and experience of gender. For Freud, the castration complex, foundational to the subject, or at least the normative male subject, is based on the boy ostensibly seeing the lack of penis in his female caretaker, usually the mother, when she is in a naked state, which thus catapults him into a lifetime of castration anxiety. Because the moment of visual horror is often followed by his glancing aside to an object he uses to replace the missing phallus metaphorically, a fetish such as the woman's shoe, or for that matter, the woman's naked body as a whole, his castration anxiety is to be palliated through visual fetishism, for example, painting or ogling images of female nudes as available fetish substitutes, as here, or other modes of objectifying and diminishing lacking women as objects of his desire. So for some of you, this is like so old hat, but I always rehearse it just to remind us. And I do still love teaching this, especially to undergraduates, because they're always kind of laughing out loud at how absurd this whole model seems to be at this point in time. Nonetheless, it's very entrenched. So while Raven and her fellow California feminists often tended towards more obviously essentializing arguments, by drawing on Freudian psychoanalysis or the later reworkings of Freud in Jacques Lacan's work, and by polarizing the debate, the self-proclaimed anti-essentialists such as Mulvey and her UK-based colleagues Griselda Pollock, Mary Kelly, and Lisa Tickner drew on psychoanalytic models of gender sex that arguably still implied that they were determinable through moments of visual identification, because relying on fetishism, that's the assumption. The implications here are certainly on first glance apparently essentializing, given Freud's clear reliance on visible anatomical gender in the anecdotal narratives describing how the subject becomes differently gendered, or in Lacan's arguments about the privileged phallus, which, though he insists it is symbolic rather than literal, continually allies with the anatomical penis in his theory, as many feminists have pointed out. By the 1980s, these debates had been deeply polarized into so-called first-generation essentialist versus so-called second-generation self-proclaimed anti-essentialist camps. And yet, for most feminists across the board working on feminist art and theory, gender-sex identifications are processed and enacted, as well as understood through the body as a felt and visible field. The question of whether a theory is essentialist or not comes down to perception of how this felt and visible field is articulated and understood. No more fetishes for the moment. This section is called Nominal Essentialisms and the Body. The body in its visibility and materiality, its putative identifiability as either male or female, as well as its social and individual experience, is key to feminist theories of gender-sex identification. But this body is never simple. As Ellen Rooney has put it, quoting Denise Riley, quote, "The body is, of course, essentialism's great text. The body can figure here as a trump card, seeming literally to embody the womanness of woman, obscuring the fact that," again quoting Riley, quote, "only at times will the body impose itself or be arranged as that of a woman or a man," unquote. Thus, importantly, Riley's observation in the late 80s already made clear that any essentialism based on embodiment, as all gender essentialisms tend to be, nonetheless can only imagine immutable difference in relation to bodies. As such, feminist theories are always courting essentialism. They cannot not court essentialism, given their goal of mapping how we identify ourselves in heteronormative regimes of sexual difference. Not to mention our continual return to our own and others' bodies as sites of gender-sex identification, as well as sites of theorizing or making art. Any method that seeks to analyze existing modes of identification, address modes of oppression of particular groups or classes of identified subjects, and open ways for change will entail essentializing moments. The essentializing elements of all theories and politics of identity must then be self-reflexively acknowledged. Coming to a fuller understanding of what we do when we essentialize is an important part of this self-reflexivity. The idea that essence, whether of the gendered body or any other materialized thing, can only be imagined and never fully known has a long history in European philosophy. In his 1689 essay concerning human understanding, for example, English philosopher John Locke explores essentialisms, the belief in essences pre-existing human experience and perception, and explores them in a way that is still productive for gaining a fuller sense of how we dance around essentialism. We continually assume essences as part of our understanding, even as we attempt to undermine a belief in them. And in fact, these dual gestures or tendencies may be necessary in inhabiting selves in a social regime that is still more or less identity-based, as indeed Euro-American culture still clearly is. Locke begins with the Aristotelian concept of real essences. In the words of queer feminist theorist Teresa de Lauretis, citing Locke, the real essence is, quote, the objective character, intrinsic nature as a thing in itself, that internal constitution on which all the sensible properties depend, unquote. In contrast, de Lauretis argues, the nominal essence for Locke is the way in which we come to know a thing, quote, the totality of the properties, constituent elements, etc., without which it would cease to be the same thing, unquote. For Locke, the nominal essence is the interpreted idea based on linguistic descriptions of what something is as determined through our experience of its shared quality with other like substances or things. Clearly, as de Lauretis and Diana Fuss have both pointed out, when even the most supposedly die-hard essentialist feminists make their arguments, they tend to be relying on nominal essentialism, not on the idea of an immutable embodied femininity or womanness that can never be changed. However, as Fuss warns, quote, I would, however, wish to point out that nominal essences are often treated by post-Lockeans as if they were real essences, unquote. As long as we live in heteronormative patriarchy, we will need to conceptualize sex-gender identification in terms of Locke's concept of nominal essences, imagining we know what a woman is in order to counter the oppression of people identified as women as a class. The remainder of this paper will examine in more detail arguments about essentialism within feminist visual theory and end by returning to the currently hotly debated issue of transgender or gender-fluid identification. So the next section is an overview of essentialisms in US and UK-based feminist art discourse from the 70s through the mid-90s. Due to the stakes involved, as I have suggested, feminist art and the debates around it were invested in particularly interesting and telling ways in interrogating the uses and dangers of essentialism. As noted above, the raging debates in feminist art history and visual theory tended to position as radically antagonistic the so-called essentialists and the self-proclaimed anti-essentialists. Each both constituted, defined, and resisted the other, creating more of a binary than, in fact, the complexity of the artwork and theory being made on either side actually justified. Other feminist theorists have also pointed to the co-constitutive nature of essentialist and anti-essentialist feminisms. Most notably Diana Fuss, who in 1989 argued polemically that, quote, essentialism is essential to social constructivism, which is another word for anti-essentialism. The most important founding moment in the establishment of an arguably essentializing view of feminist visual art was the 1973 publication of the polemic crystallized by Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro in their influential article, Female Imagery, where they theorized central core imagery in Woman's Space Journal. Drawing on ideas developed with their students in consciousness-raising sessions, Chicago and Shapiro begin with questions and end with assertions crystallizing their concept of a central core emphasis as defining female imagery. So there's a long quote here. I'm just going to read the underlined part. We are suggesting that women artists have used the central cavity which defines them as women as the framework for an imagery which allows for the complete reversal of the way in which women are seen by the culture. This got them into a lot of trouble. Many feminist art historians, artists, and critics debated this concept, from Cindy Nemser and Lucy Lepard in the US to Lisa Tickner and Mary Kelly in the UK. A growing number of feminists based in New York, such as Jane Weinstock, vehemently rejected the concepts of central core imagery, goddess imagery, another common trope of feminist art in this period, and even a general female imagery or female sensibility. Even at its most extreme exemplification, in the texts and artworks of Chicago and the feminist art program Artists, which was her teaching venue in Southern California, however, the idea of a particular women's art based on concepts about women's experience that courted essentialism was only ever equivocally essentialist. In Locke's terms, it was nominally essentialist. And of course, you have to look at it in the context of the time and the purpose of making such an extreme polemic. Feminist theorists reacted strongly, however, against what they perceived as a brute essentialism, which Chicago and Shapiro's elisions of women's bodies into a universalizing notion of women's experiences to them exemplified. The London and later Glasgow-based film journal Screen was a key site of these critiques. British feminist film theorist Stephen Heath influentially theorized gender in terms of sexual difference based on psychoanalytical models. And the feminist artist and critic Mary Kelly argued explicitly in a 1982 interview that there is no essential femininity, asserting as well that, quote, a method needs to be employed which foregrounds the construction of femininity as a representation of difference within a specific discourse. There is no pre-existing sexuality, unquote. As these arguments make clear, a shift had thus occurred from the mid-1970s when many feminists in the visual arts had been calling for some kind of attention to a universalizable women's experience and female imagery, which of course was really about white middle-class women, as has been pointed out many times. A shift from that to an emphasis in the 1980s on a Freudian model of sexual difference siphoned through Jacques Lacan and underlaid by Marxist concerns informed by Louis Althusser's work. So Lisa Tickner noted in 1984, the result was a shift in emphasis from equal rights struggles in the sexual division of labor and a cultural feminism founded on the evaluation of existing biological or social femininity to a recognition of the processes of sexual differentiation, the instability of gender positions, and the hopelessness of excavating a free or original femininity beneath the layers of patriarchal oppression. The key strategy that the anti-essentialist or social constructionist feminist theories called for during this time, which we could loosely associate with the 1980s, aligning them with the rise of postmodern theory, was the strategy of what Judith Berry and Sandy Flitterman in a 1980 article in Screen called, quote, "Critical Awareness of the Construction of Femininity," unquote. A criticality that could be put in motion by feminist artists such as Kolbowski and Kruger Images here, using methods to thwart visual pleasure or fetishism in relation to the fetishized, objectified female body. So it's very much based on kind of that idea of Freud's theory of fetishism. For British feminist visual theorists publishing in Screen and other key venues, including Griselda Pollock, this criticality had to be one based on distanciation or defamiliarization, terms drawn from avant-garde theory. As Pollock put it in terms explicitly taken from Bertolt Brecht's theory of radical theater and returning us to Freud, quote, "Distanciation is an erosion of the dominant structures of cultural consumption, which are classically fetishistic. Feminist critical practice must resist such specularity, especially when the visible object par excellence is the image of woman," unquote. Needless to say, this entreaty served to exclude the supposedly essentializing work of feminist body artists or, as with Judy Chicago, artists and theorists focusing on central core imagery. So that was the kind of drawing of the battle lines. And of course, you couldn't do without the dinner party in this context. And you have to refer to what is the wonderful poster through that doorway. It says something like, "We've had enough of the dinner party." This is why. It's not surprising, given the intensity of these debates, that the history of 1970s and 1980s feminist art and art discourse seems to fall within a clearly drawn opposition, again, between essentialists and anti-essentialists, even though the two were, per Fuss's argument, co-constituted rather than unconnected polar opposites. And in fact, they actually overlap a lot, too. At the extreme ends of the polemic, Mary Kelly's theory and her art were lauded as epitomizing the anti-essentializing ideal by Pollock, Tickner, and others. While by the 1980s, Judy Chicago and her work were often dismissed by these same theorists as paradigmatic of an essentializing theory and practice linked to her increasingly spectacular and explicit central core imagery, which reached its apogee in Chicago's ambitious installation piece, The Dinner Party, with its largely vulvar ceramic plates and massive table and floor structure, completed in 1979. Kelly's Lacanian postpartum document, conveniently also completed in 1979, released in segments even as The Dinner Party was being made and revealed to the public, becomes, in the anti-essentialist feminist theory, the antithesis of Chicago's opus. And this was like when I was entering into feminist discourse, this was this opposition that was being created. These binarizing accounts are clearly, to some degree, caricatures of the complexities of Kelly's and Chicago's thinking, not to mention of the vast array of feminist debates on the topic over the decades of the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s, and it'll be really interesting to see what Anne has to say about the Australian versions of those. What finally shifted attention away from essentialism as a key term of debates in feminist art, leaving these antagonisms more or less behind, was the dramatic explosion of queer feminist literary theory and philosophy in the early 1990s, in particular the work of Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick in literary theory and Judith Butler in philosophy. Sedgwick's profoundly de-essentializing accounts of queer feminist theory and subjectivity have had a lingering effect on feminist visual studies, partly through the scholarship of her former students, such as Jose Esteban Munoz and Jennifer Doyle. Butler's impact has been more singular, reducible largely to the key arguments on gender as performance published around 1990. The role of the AIDS crisis, particularly intense in the US from the mid-1980s through the 1990s, also had an impact on how feminists navigated community and the political issues surrounding sexuality. The brute physical aspects of the transmission of AIDS emphasized the absolute necessity of attending to bodily desires, limits, and functions in articulating any politics relating to feminism. Women identified as straight, lesbian, bi, as well as trans women and trans men often claimed common cause with the primarily gay male urban communities beset by AIDS. Within this context, essentialism as a central polemic and claims for a specific female experience or imagery faded into the background and gender performativity moved to the foreground as a more progressive and convincing way to theorize how we occupy gendered and sexed bodies. Through the work of scholars such as Sedgwick, Butler, and Teresa de Lauretis, queer feminist theory emerged in the 1990s in humanities and arts departments in universities across the US and UK, and I'm sure here as well, in tandem with shifts in feminist theory and a turn in politically radical and marginalized communities towards political action inspired by anti-racist identity politics and post-colonial theory, and seeking to dissect conventionally fixed or at least narrowly defined notions of identity. Entering the arenas of gender and sexuality, queer feminist theorists picked up Foucault's social constructivist and historical work on discourses of sexuality, merging it with elements of psychoanalysis, a Marxist attention to class critique, performance theory, and put these to work destabilizing gender and sexuality as they had developed in theories up to that point. Butler's and Sedgwick's models relied on the notion of the performative, developed first by J.L. Austin in the mid-50s in a series of lectures that were published in the early 60s. And so, of course, famously, Butler theorized this in a 1988 article that was then rewritten into her book, Gender Trouble, most famously articulating gender as a stylized repetition of acts. So Butler applied the Austinian ideal of the performative to gender and sex identification, and I think one of the most influential chapters or essays that she wrote was actually in Bodies That Matter from 1993, where she writes about Paris's burning, which I'm feeling like has this resonance still among a lot of queer performers, that they read that, watched the movie, and this has had a lot of resonance. While in her 1993 Tendencies, Sedgwick argued against the binarisms of previous models of identity politics, including many forms of feminism. And this is my personal favorite quote that's been very influential, is articulating queer as a mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, and resonances. Attending to race and sexuality as always already constitutive of gender, Sedgwick is clear on articulating a feminist theory that insists on gender as performative, queer, and never fully determinable. With gender performativity as a point of departure, this radical new theory was simultaneously queer and feminist, even if in Butler's case it was structured still by lingering binarisms and a universalizing logic which arguably courts essentialism. Feminist art historians began to address the performativity of gender as it had already been articulated in photographic and performance practices in the visual arts, For example, Claude Cahun's, Lynn Hirschman-Leeson's, Hannah Wilke's, Cindy Sherman's gender, sex, performative self-images, which seemed ripe for analysis, and the Butler arguments became very, I think, instrumentalized as they were applied. But still lurking within these models, an implicit essentialism implied that these white women artists from relatively privileged Euro-American backgrounds could perform femininity in radical but implicitly universalizable ways. So I think that problem was still there. Still tending conceptually to separate gender and sexuality off from other aspects of experience or identification. Through the 1990s, feminist visual theory and practice then tended still to assume normatively white, middle-class, Euro-American femininity as its basis of analysis and production. Even if, as with Cahun and Wilke, this femininity was definitively Jewish, as well as in Cahun's case, being definitively queered. Many other key feminist scholars and theorists from fields as diverse as law, sociology, and anthropology were, however, busy interrogating these assumptions, pointing to lingering essentialisms limiting feminism through the tendency to cite white middle-class Euro-American women's experience as universalizable to all women. For example, Bell Hooks has persistently and courageously developed a feminism that is inherently race-critical and pointedly addresses the experiences of black women in the US in relation to visual culture. And US-based black feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw developed her theory of intersectionality in the early 1990s at the culmination of debates about identity politics and around the question of multiculturalism, which became a code word for US cultural institutions' attempts to deal with racial and ethnic difference. Crenshaw's theory argues for a consideration of the interrelation of forms of oppression, particularly race, gender, and class-related, affecting black women, and troubles a simplistic belief in the universalizable shared experiences of all women. At the same time, the advent of third-wave feminism or transnational feminism, trans studies, critical race theory, post-colonial and decolonial theory, and masculinity studies, all burgeoning in the 1990s and 2000s, have also offered models for complicating the tendency in feminist and gay and lesbian histories of art to posit categories of gendered identity as knowable, as binaristic at their foundations, as implicitly white, and as separate from intersectional identifications. From Jose Munoz to Jack Halberstam, most of these authors have emerged from other disciplines than art history. Few of them are aware of or build on the extensive debates about essentialism within feminist art history and feminist film theory. Since the exhilarating moment in the 1990s of the consolidation of queer feminist theories of performance and visual culture, queer theory and praxis have opened out into more and more complex variants. As many have argued, the additive tendency developing out of the gay and lesbian movements of the late 1960s, which ultimately results in unwieldy acronyms such as LGBTQIAAP, that was the most recent I could find, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, allies, and pansexual, is less convincing as an effective tool for claiming rights and freedoms for those of all sex, gender identifications than the more fluid models of gender and sexuality developing in tandem with increasingly visible trans and genderqueer communities and politics. One could argue that the acronymic approach, if we could call it that, continues, in fact, to essentialize by assuming that if we just include enough categories, each person can be placed within one of them. To fit a category is to be essentially determinable. In contrast, genderqueer and trans, sometimes written trans asterisk, depending on the context, a term including multiple gray areas and interrelated concepts of gender identification, including genderqueer, gender variant, gender nonconforming, provide a more useful way of thinking gender-sex identification away from or against the grain of singular positions or identities, no matter how multiplicitous these are. To this end, it's important to note the way in which, even in queer theory, a belief in nominal essences still continually slides back into an implication that real essences underlie nominal ones. So much is clear if one attends closely to claims made in debates in art discourse and beyond about queer subjectivity, art or otherwise, in the 1990s and early 2000s. As signaled by Sedgwick's argument noted above, these discourses which deploy aggressively anti-essentialist and or social constructionist language claim a radical openness in relation to sexual identification, separating sexuality from anatomical attributes or even from sexual object choice. But at the same time, they continually slide back into assumptions that a person is queer if they have had sex, if they have sex with or express desire for a person perceived not to be the opposite gender, eliding queer with gay and lesbian. This slippage relies on the idea that the original gender of the body of the person in question can be determined and identified in relation to the person's sexual object choice, implying that even queer can be and often is deployed in an essentializing way. But at the same time, the stakes of queer theory are such that using queer to accommodate any subject or cultural product for which one wishes to make radical claims is also deeply problematic. As Sedgwick herself recognized well, noting that, quote, because of the historical and contemporary force of the prohibitions against every same-sex sexual expression, for anyone to disavow these meanings or to displace them from the term's definitional center would be to dematerialize any possibility of queerness itself. At the same time, she continues, a lot of the most exciting recent work around queer spins the term outward along dimensions that can't be subsumed under gender and sexuality at all. Unquote. And in the States, this is often through, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of amazing work in Black studies and Chicano studies. If we take Sedgwick's point, Chicago's gorgeous spray-painted central core images can be considered queer. This open concept, in fact, was embraced by the curators of the 1995 exhibition In a Different Light at the Berkeley Art Museum, who included Chicago's work in this show of queer practice. Clearly, identities and identifications are a question of interrelational interpretations. Any attention to essentialism, and even Locke assists in understanding this, must honestly address what's going on in the interpretive process through which we identify each other in works of art and through which we thus make meaning. Even when we think we are not relying on an idea of predetermined essences or identifiable attributes, we arguably are always doing so in some way. We cannot even speak of redressing social inequalities, for example, unless we identify particular bodies, subjects through mostly visible but possibly linguistic, oral tropes or signs, linking them to the oppressed class or group, the members of which are being unfairly treated because of this apparent identity. Even when we point the finger at other feminists for essentializing, we are ourselves reductively categorizing and excluding, most often failing to acknowledge our own dependency on their putative essentialism for our self-proclaimed anti-essentialism, as Fuss's insights make clear. Spivak, again, most brilliantly excavates these contradictions in Feminist and Postcolonial Theory in the 1994 interview I cited at the beginning. Addressing subaltern studies in terms of analyzing cultural texts, Spivak is clear on the uses of essentialism, and this is where she says, there's the spaces where women oozes away, I have no time for essence, anti-essence. Spivak's comments are particularly perspicuous if viewed in relation to the massive shifts in the acceptance and even glamorizing of gay, lesbian, and transgender subjects in the early 2000s, especially here I'm speaking mostly of the US. All of the debates about same-sex marriage, for example, have tended to reinforce rather than to erode essentializing binary categories of gender, with the male-female binary simply doubled by the hetero-homosexual one. Just because two women can now marry does not mean that the state is ratifying an open or fluid concept of gender identification. To the contrary, the legal rhetoric of same-sex marriage in the US, for example, relies heavily on the assumption that we know what we mean or see when woman or man is evoked. Marriage, after all, is by definition a binary structure, whether or not of opposite or identical genders. So this is this kind of sudden fad in US popular culture. In 2015, which is when I was finishing this essay, so like you couldn't escape this, such assumptions are being both reinforced and profoundly challenged by the rise of the visible trans culture, particularly in the US. Trans with no asterisk can imply any transgender or transsexual discourse or person, including that attached to figures such as Caitlyn Jenner, the M to F former Olympian and reality TV star, formerly Bruce Jenner. Jenner has tended to be viewed not as fluid in gender, but in conventional terms as aligning with the opposite gender to that of her original male anatomical body. On her briefly aired TV show, I Am Kate, she repeatedly claimed her emergence into her authentic gender. In the context of debates about essentialism, I would insist that there's nothing authentic about this particular kind of femaleness claimed by Jenner. That said, there's nothing authentic about gender, period. And self-proclaimed feminists who are transphobically reacting against the new visibility of trans culture by asserting essentialist claims about being a woman or to reclaim women's spaces are clearly not getting the point either. As Julie Negoshi and Stefan E. Brazuzzi have argued, quote, transgenders differ widely in their degree of belief in the fluidity of gender identity. Some accept such fluidity only to the extent that one can switch between two otherwise separate essentialist and pure gender categories, whereas others believe that an embodied gender identity is still highly malleable, unquote. It's complicated, but at the time I finished this essay, the term trans asterisk referred more to the gender fluid concept and to genderqueer identifications. And the work of Jack Halberstam and Paul Preciado typifies those arguments. Clearly, popular culture versions of transgender people hardly tell the full story of the 21st century trans narrative for younger generations in particular. In fact, trans cultures and discourse develop more or less consistently from queer theory's insistence on gender and sexuality as determined through relational and always psychically overdetermined interactions. The most convincing of such theories necessarily account for the social scene with its myriad codes of behavior and individual identifications and desires. As Jack Halberstam, theorizing what he calls gender ambiguity in relation to visual culture, has noted, quote, there are a variety of gender deviant bodies under the sign of non-normative masculinities and femininities, and the task at hand is not to decide which represents the place of most resistance, but to begin the work of documenting their distinctive features, unquote. This documenting and analyzing process might begin with visuality, but it cannot depend upon it. As Halberstam recognizes, quote, gender ambiguity results from and contests the dominance of the visual within contemporary culture. In this way, Caitlyn Jenner's transition, which was publicly enacted through theatrical visual strategies involving the adoption of hyperbolically feminine clothing, makeup, and hairdos, might seem visually to confirm her authentic femaleness. However, as I suggested above, this femaleness, because it is performative, but also based on explicitly superficial attributes, can ironically only ever point to the impossibility of gender being fully knowable or livable or visible in any secure way. Lifting Caitlin's skirt, as it were, would only produce apparently irrefutable essential visual evidence that would or would not contradict the femaleness enacted through these superficial means and provide more confusion as to what gender means or is. The mistake in this formulation is to believe that visual codes can secure or confirm authentic gender, or in fact that authentic gender exists at all. Gender's claim to authentic femininity is just as riven with moments of pure disidentification and disjunction as it is with moments wherein her femininity or womanness seems secure. In a sense, with trans and trans-astrous cultures and modes of embodiment and visuality, we're back at square one of the problem of essentialism as it haunts feminist theory. At the same time, while no trans theory and no queer theory has succeeded in being fully anti-essentialist, genderqueer trans discourse can radically challenge even the idea of gender, founded as it has been in European-based cultures and in psychoanalysis, on a binary opposition between male and female as staged within a heteronormative binary of proper or improper object choice. The heteronormative model of gender as male or female is aligned with opposite sex or same-sex object choice as homo or heterosexual is profoundly thrown in question by trans bodies and modes of being that refuse to align easily and visibly to these binary categories. Given the complexities of this terrain opened up by the popular enactment of trans subjects, perhaps the point now for feminist theory might be to acknowledge the right to the desire to essentialize. Why shouldn't Jenner or anyone else less advantaged and with less access to mainstream popular media be allowed to fantasize a kind of essential gender identity, to imagine they have an authentic inner gender that only needs to be matched by their outer attributes? The very desire to essentialize itself, spoken aloud, can freeze and prohibit expression, but it can also create a space of movement where the essential is revealed as both activated and necessary to imagine, yet impossible to achieve. And I'll just leave you with a better image than Caitlyn Jenner if we really want to complicate gender and sexuality. Thank you. So, Anne, you're joining me out here?
Thank you. That was, oh, here, we've both got one now. Okay, great. I think that was a very fitting kind of keynote conclusion to ACCA's program over the summer, because a lot has happened here and a lot has gone down, and to have the sexuality thing as the last kind of major thing, I think is really good. Because the things that have rifted through this space and rifted through the House project that I was coordinating as well have been race and sexuality. These two kind of issues that seem almost fundamental throughout the theories of feminism. And to end on this, the kind of, if you like, gender ambiguity of queerness and where that's going now. I've read quite a lot around this, and I actually went back to Spivak's interview today to have a look at that. What's interesting about that interview is the way in which she kind of slips and slides around, because she really doesn't want to come out not as a social constructivist in a way, like she, but because of her involvement in, for want of a better word, kind of social justice programs in India, where she runs all these schools, she's very connected to difference in identity as well. But she used the word, I think she uses the word, she says as a deconstructivist, it's a dangerous concept. Yeah. I wonder if I mean, I'm jumbling around here because from an art historian's point of view, where we look at the visual language that artists have used from Chicago, obviously, and that the fantastic 1979 comparison between Judy Chicago's Dinner Party and Mary Kelly's postpartum document, which are meant to be these binary oppositions of feminist theory, and yet they're happening concurrently. And not ironical that they're both Americans, even if one lives in the UK. And you know, these kind of dialogues seem to rift through the art world, and sometimes I think the artists are going faster than the theorists, because we have to spend a lot of time in our studies writing, whereas they have these studio practices that can be more immediate. And I wondered if you wanted to say anything about queer art as it's kind of, develops the wrong word, but its presence in debates around queer. Say from Livingston's film, which was so influential, and where it's gone since then, either in film or in visual art.
Is this on?
Yep.
Everyone here? Well, I'm writing a book on, as was mentioned, on queer performance. So that would probably be another 4 hours if I were really go into that. But yeah, what interests me is partly that trajectory where gender gets put more and more openly in motion, rather than the understandable moment where gender needed to be claimed. And my position is, it's not about trashing the earlier feminists for not being smart enough to see that gender is performed. You know, we have to understand that they were doing what seemed necessary at the time. And that goes for both Mary Kelly, who's my colleague at USC now, by the way, so she's living in LA, and Judy Chicago. You know, they had different strategies. There are some overlaps in what they were doing, but they both had, well, they had related goals, right? But they chose different means. And what happens with the, you know, explosion, really, of queer activism with the AIDS crisis is where you have this, you know, really dramatic opening, very urgent opening to other ways of trying to understand gender and sexuality that, and interestingly, it is the two women feminists who are the most important theorists of queer, Butler and Sedgwick, I think. There are others, I mean, Fuss and De Lauretis, but they're almost all women. That's a whole thing we could talk about. I think because feminism had already created a structure for trying to think about how we navigate the world as gendered subjects. However, you asked about the art. And again, you know, I'm interested in so many different kinds of art that come out of that moment, but mostly the performance stuff is what's on my mind. So Ron Athey is someone I'm spending a lot of time on because I'm curating a retrospective of his work. And he is kind of on the far end of being, you know, a totally performance artist, performer, you know. He doesn't make stuff, not interested in documentation. All the documentation is kind of happenstance. And he's kind of a box-ticking queer. You know, there's no one who would question whether he belongs in that category. Although it might be interesting to question it. But so anything from that to a whole generation of younger, emerging, many artists of color doing really, I would say, queering identity in a kind of generalized intersectional way. So anyone from now Bustamante, who's also my colleague, to younger artists like Zandra Ibarra, there are other people I could mention, but there's this whole surge since the, I would say since the mid-1990s of artists just insistently enacting this kind of intersectional gender fluidity in ways that really interest me.
I'll just throw maybe a bit of a curly question at you. You did the kind of the LGBTIQ
I don't even remember
list, and saw that as a kind of maybe a reclaiming of identity. So there's this whole thing that riffs through, you know, gay, lesbian, queer studies, which is about identity and claiming identity, which, in going back to that Spivak article, is also to do with rights and justice. And you mentioned that as well. Yeah. And I'm wondering, I mean, we are so, you know, it's very politically correct to use the LGBTI kind of formula to be this inclusive, and you also talked about you know, what I would call the neoliberalisation, if you like, of the acceptance of same-sex marriage. And I wonder, is there going to be in our, you know, especially white corporate patriarchal societies, this embracing of all of these others as the same in the similar way to something like the gay marriage thing does?
Well, that's kind of what I Am Kate does, right? So
Yeah.
there are examples in American popular culture of this total popularization of something that, you know, 15 or 20 years ago, people would not even talk about. So in that way, it's fascinating. We have Transparent.
We're great fans of Transparent.
And I cut out a part, actually. There's a chunk at the end where I talk about Zachary Drucker, who is a really interesting trans woman performance artist who's conveniently also the major producer on Transparent. So I'm able to tie together like a little more radical example of popular culture with performance practice, because Zachary does a very beautiful piece that kind of activates the relationality of gender and sexuality. I've forgotten your question.
It's all right. It's all right. We're just in conversation.
I just got off on Zachary.
It's all right. Okay. I mean, but talking about that, if we went to something like Butler's analysis of, which I can hardly remember actually, it's so long ago, but Paris is Burning. But I remember the film very well, and you know, we used to teach it at university. People used to watch the film and get so much from the film. And that is so much about the performing of the drag kings and the performing of masculinities. And we had
drag queens. They're drag
queens. And aren't there drag kings in it as well?
Not really. No.
Oh, okay.
It's
drag
really
queens.
it's voguing culture. Yeah.
Right.
It's all drag queens.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And I was thinking of Della Grace Volcano, who used to be Della Grace as a photographer, and she came out here round about the same time in the 90s.
Oh, interesting.
And she was a drag king, so I was getting that kind of muddled up. Now I've lost my train of thought. No, this is it. And is there a point where, like, the obvious performance of the essentialised look with the kind of, if you like, the mainstreaming of a feminine identity or a masculine identity, that seems to me anyway to be easily absorbable into the same, because one is performing quite directly to the other, and the desire is to become other, even though when you lift the skirt or pull down the trousers, it's obvious that it's not.
It depends.
But so is it in that moment where, and I think that Butler says this, where it's obvious that the person doesn't pass, that's a more fluid kind of position?
Yeah, it's a very problematic area because my argument would be that you may pass for one audience member and not for another. So I think, yes, what Butler wanted to do with that film was talk about a denaturalizing of gender. But it's very problematic, right? Because there's so many ways to argue, and that have been argued, about the difficulty of theorizing and understanding what drag does, particularly drag queens. And one simple way of problematizing it is just to say, like, I'm wearing a dress today, but I almost never, I'm kind of in drag. Like, I don't identify at all with those attributes of femininity that Caitlyn Jenner thinks makes her an authentic woman, you know? Now, the Paris is Burning is a very different thing, right? It's queer people, it's marginal people, it's people who have formed a community on the basis of a kind of celebratory version of drag queenery. Yeah. And one of, I don't know how much Butler goes into this, but one of the points is that it's a very, very specific context. So anyone who is apprehending, if it's live, is going to be in that very specific context. It's not, you're not going to mistake it for, you know, a beauty pageant with anatomically female people, right? No. What Butler didn't really count on was the extent to which her using Paris is Burning as exemplary of gender performance would end up so thoroughly infiltrating humanities departments and art schools that now when I'm in Auckland trying to see Indigenous performance, it looks a lot like Paris is Burning, you know? Wow. And I'm thinking like, and I don't know anything about it yet, so that's kind of why I'm in Auckland, is to try to denaturalize this very kind of white North American perspective. But I want to know more about, you know, how for example, the FAFSWAG group in Auckland, has anyone heard of them? Fabulous drag, like voguing performances, and they dominated Pride Week. It was really fun. But some of it comes straight out of that movie for me, you know, but maybe I'm missing stuff. I want to know, like, what are the aspects of gender fluidity that might come more from their, you know, home culture, or their aspects, particularly of, I think, Samoan culture has arguably one of these figures who's kind of a third sex figure. So, like, that's fascinating to me, is just how much a theorist's construction of a cultural product can then have these echoes out because of the way that text is taught and the film is shown. Yeah. And it's a pretty singular film, right? I mean, there are many, 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 many other drag cultures going on from long before Jenny Livingston did that film. So.
One of the Australian characters that I thought might have been on your screen is Lee Bowery.
Oh, yeah. Lee Bowery is amazing. And I don't know that much about Lee Bowery, but I know that in the Ron Athey exhibition will be the Lee Bowery cape that Ron owns. Yeah. And Ron looks really good in it, by the way. And Kathy Opie took a picture of Ron. So there are all these great kind of levels of queer representation. Yeah. Yeah.
And he did some pretty full-on body art himself.
Absolutely, yeah. No, amazing person. And very well known in England, obviously, but not known in the States, which is odd. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I think the MCA did a retrospective on him, but that was after he had a retrospective in Vienna, of all places.
Yeah.
You know, the Europeans are really into him too. So he got a bit missed out in Melbourne, where he's from. But anyway.
Often happens.
Yeah. I just want to throw you one other question, and then we can open it up to the audience. One of the things that's percolated in our culture here in Australia has been new materialism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's and, you know, everywhere I go, everyone wants to talk about new materialism.
I wonder if you see that as a return to essentialism in some kind of way.
Yeah, maybe in a in an abstract way, I do think that there is a correspondence between the rise of social media and the desire for new materialism, which I totally understand, because I would like materiality to mean something too. I'm a little skeptical of some of the more extreme examples of it, as in like Jane Bennett's idea that trash has agency, you know, but I think it's amazing, you know, and some of it's really interesting. It's just funny that it's obviously huge here because it's literally come up in every conversation.
Yeah, it is.
And I'm not sure how I would apply it to this particular, I would apply it actually to the arguments about essentialism maybe, as a kind of echo at the end there of when it is that we reach for some sense of whether we call it an essence of something or something that can be grasped or something that seems less ephemeral. And I think very clearly the reason that happened, you know, among people like Judy Chicago and the feminist art program was, you know, absolutely political. It was absolutely urgent that they claim that there was this thing that they could identify. There was and I really honor that. Again, I came of age kind of, as I said, in the middle of those debates and immediately decided that it was a spurious thing just to dismiss an entire school of, you know, because in fact they had very good reasons for trying to claim that more material relationship to gender.
Yeah. And of course, some of the French feminists have never given that away.
Exactly.
You know, like Cixou and people like that.
Irigaray actually is a total essentialist.
Yeah, well, no, Spivak said she didn't think she was.
Well, I would beg to differ, having had a conversation with her at a conference where she was doing all this far-out psychology research on inherent gender.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's heavily into gender difference.
Yeah.
We should open it up to the floor, I think, and take questions.
There's someone over there.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's fascinating. I'm interested, you talk about duration as a way of identifying, and you sort of say talk about, and I'm wondering if that's linked to your interest in performance, and performance as a way of opening up a fluidity of identity, and if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, can I borrow your phallus? Yeah, that's exactly, on some deep level, I think that's exactly what I've always been interested in, is kind of the self or the subject as a social being who's constantly interacting with situations and other subjects. And it's, this book on queer performance actually is arguing there's this intellectual and creative genealogy that explodes into the foreground in the post-World War II period that has to do with this. Suddenly there's sociologists and linguistic philosophers like J.L. Austin and artists and ultimately feminist and queer theorists who are starting to theorize the self as in process. And of course, my argument is that, like you were saying, you know, artists theorize, right? Like whether they're painting a painting or doing conceptual art, they're theorizing something, they're manifesting something. And so it's not a coincidence that right at the time that J.L. Austin was inventing the term performative, that you have a group of artists at Black Mountain College doing the first kind of, at least post-war, kind of performative event, and breaking down the boundaries between the arts and, you know, involving the audience in the work of art. So the theory of this new book I'm writing as a whole is that there are all these parallel energies that are occurring, And of course, they're all related as well to the social situation and the political situation and the rights movements. So there's a really strong drive for black artists and women artists, et cetera, to use their bodies in their work to, denaturalize the kind of modernist restrictions that meant that only white men could make art, but you didn't really notice their bodies because it was all this kind of, hierarchical abstract system that people of color and women and queers could never participate in. So it's all part of this huge shift, which of course it relates to post-structuralism and debates around postmodernism and so on. So I am very interested in that, yeah.
Thank you for your very insightful talk. I just wanted to ask you what you think the value of art is, even if it is extraordinarily problematic, in making visible sort of fantasies of essentialism and authenticity, even if its value is only to prompt analysis and critique. Like, for example, could Caitlyn Jenner be a very valuable performance artist?
I kind of never legislate whether something's art or performance art or not. I mean, I don't really see the point in setting boundaries or making proclamations. Personally, for me, I think there's a big difference between what Zachary Drucker or Vaginal Davis is doing and what Caitlyn Jenner is doing. And Caitlyn Jenner is coming out of the most bizarre trajectory of a human being over the last 50 years. I mean, like an Olympic male star to this trashy reality TV family to this coming out story as a trans. I mean, you could definitely not make that up. But it doesn't function for me the same way as the performances function at all. And so I would want to just look at it within how it's functioning within the medium it's being manifest in, and how that medium is purveying that particular body, what's being said within the show, around the show as a mainstream television vehicle. It's even in comparison to Transparent, which is produced, whatever. It's released as a kind of experimental television, so there's this whole other thing around it, even though structurally it's actually pretty similar. But so yeah, I just wouldn't. I don't find it useful, certainly not to build up Caitlyn Jenner as somehow pushing forward gender fluidity, because Caitlyn Jenner represents the absolutely essentializing kind of arm of transgender. That said, of course there's some positive elements to that visible a person being a trans person on television. And by the way, Zachary Drucker also appears in I Am Kate, so it's kind of fun at the end because Zachary's just this kind of weird, ubiquitous figure. And living in LA, you can have that kind of experience of, knowing someone who went to CalArts and is a performance artist, but also knows Caitlyn Jenner. And Zachary's job on I Am Kate was, along with a group of more working class trans women of color, was, the classic reality TV thing to kind of like prod and poke Caitlyn, who's never in her life hung out with someone who's not a millionaire, kind of thing. So if you're interested, I recommend watching it just as a bizarre example of a kind of Hollywood version of trans, that they're kind of, 10% of it is they're trying to problematize Caitlyn Jenner's privilege, and Zachary's role was to really push her on that, and so.
this might be problematic because I've lost my voice, but thank you for your talk. And what I've gathered, something that I've kind of gathered from your arguments about essentialism is that possibly during the time that it was most rife and suited the time, in the 70s, for example, essentialism seems to have been maybe an assertion of gender in like response or reflection to the way that a person would have felt their internalized objectivity or otherness. And I just wanted to know if could you please speak a bit more about the function of essentialism in that time? Because,
I think it was actually less...
Of what you said, that we've got to see it as a point in time.
I think it was actually less subtle than you're implying. It wasn't about internalized ideologies of gender roles. It was literally, you have a vagina, therefore you will make images that look like vagina. I mean, that was the polemic. I loved it. I mean, I love that stuff, you know.
And remind me, who was the artist that did the vagina paintings?
Oh, there were lots of them. I mean, Judy was the best known and was a major figure in that she co-wrote...
I mean the body artist that did actually vagina paintings, like held the paintbrush in her vagina.
Shigeko Kubota in the 1960s, which was not really related to this moment.
No, it's just weird way my brain works.
Yeah. But Judy was a very important teacher, so she had a lot of influence because she co-wrote that article with Miriam Shapiro, and then she also was teaching all these younger feminists like Faith Wilding, and so there were a lot of people doing that kind of work at that time. And I noticed who did that fabulous enamel cunt work in the show. It's wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. Loved it. And some more recent stuff. So, yeah. No, I mean, not by her, but by younger artists. So I think it's a wonderful avenue of expression. But one of the criticisms was precisely that it wasn't about, the unconscious or some complex psychoanalytical notion of the self. It was literally just this kind of, you have this kind of body, so you will likely be drawn to this kind of image or this kind of form.
Yeah, it lacked a bit of nuance in the theory.
Yeah, but who needed nuance? I mean, they were like,
Well, the French did, kind of like if you look at what the French feminists did with their feminine writing, and, even Jill Soloway, who produces Transparent, she's talking about, she's doing the female gaze.
Yeah, but that's 2017. I mean, Jill can say that now. I mean, because those women back in 1970 had the guts to... Yeah,
but it was like it started something. I guess my point is Judy Chicago's idea hasn't died. It hasn't, even though it was on the nose of the anti-essentialists, like they didn't like it. That idea of a central core imagery or a female gaze or a feminine writing, or that is, which is essentialising, that hasn't gone away. There's still this, and in Irigaray, the essentialist, as you pointed out, I mean, it's still there. It's
of course it is, and I think that's one point I was trying to make, is that no matter how social constructionist or anti-essentialist we think we're being, we still have ideas about, oh, well, I'm doing this because I identify this way. I mean, we all do that, And I would say, yes, it's about the fact that we've internalized all sorts of things, which we do socially. I think it's...
And I guess on a very fundamental level, it was a retort to phallic art, the phallic objects and, penis paintings.
You put the Alan Jones, which, by the way, Laura Mulvey, her best article about the male gaze is actually her absolute screed against Alan Jones. It's a fabulous article. She just puts him in his place. You put that next to, Judy Chicago's dinner party plate. I mean, exactly. You know, and for years I was teaching Alan Jones. I just assumed he was being ironic. And then I wanted to reproduce that ridiculous woman as penis image in my Seeing Differently book. So I wrote to him, he's still around. He is not being ironic at all. And when he found out that and I wasn't even saying anything negative about him as an artist, but it was in the context of Laura Mulvey's arguments in my chapter on fetishism. And when he found out that the mere fact that I cited Laura Mulvey, he refused to allow me to reproduce the image. But I have some really hilarious emails from him that I plan to publish at some point. Oh, yeah.
I'm sort of out of some sort of curiosity. We're talking about Paris is Burning and I Am Kate as sort of being very, very different works of film or television. I'm curious to see what you think of potential repercussions, or just what you think of the sort of commercialization of queer culture in TV shows like RuPaul's Drag Race and things like that, where it's getting more and more mainstream and more people are watching it. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, in fact, RuPaul just got his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And my friend Annie Sprinkle was all over it, you know. So it's funny that there are these pretty strong connections now with like radical performance artists and, you know, this totally successful mainstream show. I mean, you know, Queer Eye, which just came on again, which is really totally addictive. I think it's amazing and interesting. Like, I don't draw any boundaries, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it's the same thing as, you know, someone like Vaginal Davis, who is always already super marginal to any power structures, and Vag refuses to work with, you know, permanently with any institution. So, you know, again, I would look at the specific example of who it is and how it's playing out. In RuPaul's case, from what I've seen of the show, I don't know much about RuPaul's background, actually. I think he might have some art connections with one of the art schools, but does anyone know? But the show is like, you know, could not be more hard candy, kind of Hollywood. And that's the whole point, right? It's like turning drag into this packaged spectacle. Whether or not that ultimately will be a positive thing for people who want there to be progressive effects and for gender fluidity to be possible in the future rather than an increased binarism, I don't know. We'll have to see. Yeah.
That's so cool. You're friends with Annie Sprinkle. That's not my question. My question is, I'm really into sculpture, and I recently, last year, saw the Sarah Lucas's show in San Francisco.
The what show?
Sarah Lucas's show, and it was just all these teddy bears with lots of tits made out of stockings sitting on top of the platforms for Rodin sculptures, and then some work where she's, you know, got a coat hanger with like 2 fried eggs, and then, you know, these extended legs made out of the more stockings. And I wondered where you think her work fits into essentialism, being, you know, as she was sort of coming more into prominence in the 90s.
Yeah. So the 90s, and I've written about this in various places, was a kind of black hole for feminism. It kind of wasn't at the forefront the way it had been in New York and debates about postmodernism. And, but at the same time, there were a cluster of exhibitions in the early 90s called Bad Girls, and they were actually just coincidentally 3 of them were called bad girls, which is bizarre. And Sarah Lucas definitely comes out of that kind of 1990s bad girls feminism, which was, you know, she was younger than the artists who had emerged in the 70s and 80s, right? And she and Tracy Emin and any number of other women emerging at that time, it was a kind of fuck you to the perceived rigidities of previous feminist arguments, whether it was like the theory-driven, you know, Mary Kelly, or the kind of proper celebratory feminism of Judy Chicago. So, I mean, at least these exhibitions constructed all that work as being like, fuck you know, we're gonna talk about rape and all these terrible, sloppy, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes traumatic aspects of female sexuality. And so it was a really important moment, actually. Yeah. It was still mostly white, though, has to be said.
Thank you, Amelia, for your wonderful lecture. I just, sorry, wanted to ask you, were you talking about Ron Athey?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I saw Ron Athey in Montreal a couple of years ago, or more than 10 years ago, probably now. I'm very interested, actually, in affect and politics within feminist affective politics, that is. And so Ron Athey is somebody who's really interesting as a performance artist for me, because concerning what's going on right now in the world, the suffering and trauma that is ongoing in the US, I guess this is more of a political question for you, in the sense that would you say that pain is the new regime for truth right now in terms of feminist politics?
Yeah, we're all in pain. We really are. Yeah, well, Ron lived in a rent control apartment for 25 years, and for a while he lived in London, but he still had the apartment. Zachary actually lived there. It's all part of this network. And he came back to LA around the same time I came back to LA, and then he was kicked out of his rent control apartment. So there's that kind of suffering, which is happening everywhere, I assume probably in Australia as well, where the 1% are getting richer and richer, the condo towers are going up, and no one can afford to live in big cities anymore. And that's what Ron is dealing with now. So that is actually behind the fact, not directly related, but when that happened, I was toying with the idea of doing this retrospective, and then I ended up having to take his entire archive so that he wouldn't throw it out on the street in a peak of rage at neoliberal late capitalism and what it had done to him. So there's that suffering, which again, I think is everywhere in every big city. And then there's the horror show of, what can I say? And if one more Australian comes up to me and says, what are you going to do? I mean, what I have to say to you guys is like, please take the leadership, because the US can no longer lead. So please, we're waiting for someone else to step up. That's all I can say. Should we end on that note? No, one more question.
I was really happy to have read your essay, 1970-2007, The Return of Feminist Art.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to know, I think it's a good time for this question to be asked in the Australian context, about the resurgence of feminist art in the museum and of woman as a category. And I just hoped you could maybe speak to what to do at the end of the tide when most major museums have done their recent feminist show or have put women at the forefront. Where does it go next?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a good question, but just...
Yeah, well, there have been several moments like that. One of them was in 1996-97 when I did Sexual Politics and Inside the Visible, and then disappeared completely. And then from 2005 to 2007, explosion of feminist shows all over, especially Europe and North America, and I don't know, there were probably some here. We didn't do any. Okay, you didn't do any, so you're making up for that now. Yeah, and then it was over. So that is the way a money-driven set of institutions tends to operate, is it's, you know, and we have to take advantage of it by, you know, taking that space when we can, or forcing that space when the money-driven part of it gets bored and thinks it's not scintillating enough anymore to make the money. So that's our job as, whatever, artists and thinkers, and, you know, is to keep it on the foreground. The way Black Lives Matter, for example, has been able to keep that issue on the foreground of the American consciousness. So it is kind of an activist part of what we need to do, I think. Maybe that's a better ending.
But to bounce off your question, Eloise, I think something that I've learned from the show and I think is addressed is returning the male gaze. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if that's something that you have thought about within your theories or upcoming theories in relation to performance. But I think that also applies perhaps in the wider context to how feminist practice can be enacted or challenge more structural institutions or societies. But I guess my question is more around that idea of returning the male gaze as a strategy that artists might use.
That seems somewhat outdated to me, I think. Because I think like we're at a time where the issues are so much bigger than just the structures of representation. But sure, I mean, that could be part of a really, really powerful performance or set of artworks. You have some in here where that's clearly the strategy. And you could say that, you know, Jill Soloway is obvious, you mentioned this, you know, these are people who are now in positions of power to make major film and television who probably almost certainly read Laura Mulvey and Frantz Fanon and all that, and are now, you know, in that position to actually mobilize major popular culture in ways that are very complex with transparent, right? That definitely shift away from the concept of a kind of singular authored vehicle where women's bodies are objectified. So I think in that sense, it's definitely built into a lot of the most interesting art and popular culture because people will know that, you know, they will have learned that discourse at some point. So do you know that Obama was a great president, and now he's gone, but he had read Frantz Fanon. And I just, when I found that out, I was like, oh, everything's going to be great from now on because every younger person will have read all this amazing stuff if they went to college, which they probably would have done. So yeah, I think there's a huge impact of that, and some of it's not even fully conscious, you know? I think it's just, if you've been to school and I have an 18-year-old daughter, and for her this idea of, you know, refusing the objectification of her body is just innate. It's like something that every girl in high school in LA is aware of. So I think on that level, it's built into a lot of what people are doing.
All right, well, we might finish here, and please join me in thanking Amelia Jones and Anne Marsh.
Thanks for having me.